Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long. I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. Right now we're looking at Chapter 26, which will discuss conditional sentences, types of Greek conditionals, and then look at exception clauses, and then very briefly consider qualitative emphasis. So let's continue by looking at the vocabulary. Here we're going to be looking at some special pronouns and conditional words. We have 4 different pronouns. And these pronouns will stress or be used to indicate quantity or quality depending on which one. So we have osos, ose, oson, how many, as many as, which is a relative pronoun of quantity. It'll start a relative pronoun clause. We have an interrogative pronoun of quality, puios, puia, puion, of what kind or which. We have an interrogative pronoun of quantity, posos, pose, poson, of what quantity or how many. And then we have a demonstrative pronoun of quality, to utos, to avte, to uton, such as this or of such a kind. Then we have a conditional particle, an, which is mark potential circumstance or condition. So when this particle is found, it's pointing towards a potential circumstance or condition. Then we have conditional combinations. These are conjunctions and particles working together to convey a certain semantic. So we have eon, which is a combination of e and an. It means if. We have eon me, unless or if not. E me, except if not. Eos, an, until or until ever. Osan, or os eon, whoever. Osos an, or osos eon, however so many. Opu eon, or opu an, where or wherever. Otan, which is a combination of ote and an, whenever. Well, this is the last vocabulary for Koine Greek Grammar. You will have learned 82% of the words of the Greek New Testament. That would give you the ability to recognize over 8 out of 10 words in any given sentence. Now, I actually think that you'll recognize more than that if you've been following and understanding morphology of words, how words are formed, and prefixes and suffixes, because there's a lot of combination of these forms that you've learned so far, prepositions that are added onto verb stems that you've already learned, and the combination will be obvious to you in terms of the meaning. So I think that you will probably be able to recognize closer to 85, even 90% of the Greek New Testament. So that's a great accomplishment. Be sure to look at the notes on vocabulary, and then let's talk about conditional sentences. Conditional sentences are sentences that contain a supposition, an if part, and then a conclusion, a then part. So you have a supposition, if it rains tomorrow. Then you have a conclusion, my plants will grow. Now notice that the then is optional, and in Greek you don't need it at all, although it can be marked, and to mark it would be to add some emphasis to that conclusion. We'll look at that in a moment. So a supposition involves an if clause, and then a conclusion. Now the ordering of these may vary. Now there's other terms that are used for supposition and conclusion. Protasis is used for the supposition, and apodosis is used for the conclusion. So you'll see this discussed, these terms, protasis and apodosis, used in grammars. Now the unmarked and marked order of the protasis and apodosis, typically conditions will begin with the if part, that is the protasis, the supposition. And so when you have a variation of that and you end with the protasis, the if part, then that's the marked construction. So an unmarked construction would be to begin with the supposition, the if part. The marked construction is to reverse the order and to conclude with the if part. And so when that occurs, you need to ask why. Why is an author ending with this condition, the conditional if part at the end. Now we need to talk about the truthfulness or not of conditions. There's been a lot of debate and concern about how true are these conditions. But the basic logic of a condition is it suppositional? If the protasis, the if part is true, then typically the conclusion would follow. So what is stressed is simply this. If the supposition is true, the conclusion would also be true. Now, context would need to be taken into account whether this truth connection, this logic is accurate or not. And you'd have to just look at the individual author and the circumstances to make that determination. So, for example, consider what Jesus says about himself for the sake of argument. I mean, this is obviously not true. He says, if I myself by Beelzebul am casting out demons, your sons, by whom are they casting them out? Now, this comes out of the words of Jesus himself. Obviously, the supposition is not true, but the logic between the supposition and the conclusion would be true. And that's the genius of conditional sentences, is that they're assuming a logic. The truthfulness of the claims is another matter, and that needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis, who is speaking, and what other indicators are there. Now, there are conditional constructions that we'll see which are actually marked as being untrue, and these are called contrary to fact conditions. Typically, we can assume that a condition is being presented as true for the sake of argument, but the actual truth claim would need to be investigated on its own terms, as in this case from Matthew 12:27. To negate conditional statements, you use both ou and may, depending on the construction, so you'll have to notice that in the constructions as they're presented. Now, Greek has many different types of conditions, and these conditions are very dynamic. And I'm going to be presenting to you a different classification system than do most New Testament grammars. Most New Testament grammars will use a first, second, third, fourth class division. But this classification system, for me, obscures students to the dynamics, the time frame, and the particular dynamics of the construction. And so I'm going to be presenting to you a temporal functional classification system, which is found described in Herbert Smythe's Classical Greek Grammar. And I have found this to be very helpful, very fruitful for exegesis, because his classification system allows for us to recognize mixed conditions, the fact that you're going to have combination of types of conditions. You'll have a supposition of one type and then a conclusion of another type. So hang on, this may seem a little bit complicated, but I think you'll really enjoy understanding the different time frames and then the different types of conditions. I have some charts that allow you to compare the class system, first, second, third, fourth class, and then the functional temporal classification of Smythe. Here, again, I give a little bit more detail, talking about the type of condition, and then the protasis, the if part, the apodosis part, and then the functional temporal classification name. And so what I'm going to do next, though, is really explain this temporal functional classification. And basically, you have future conditions, that is, conditions that are cast into future time. You've got present conditions, conditions that are cast in present time, and then you have past conditions, that is, conditions that are marked for remoteness of time, past time, and these have each different constructions. And I've summarized these constructions here. This is like a handy chart, a go-to chart of looking at constructions that are conditions. And so by looking at this chart, you can quickly ascertain what kind of condition you're looking at. Now, I've also indicated already, and I have a discrete section on this a little bit later on, that conditions can be of mixed types. They might start out with a future orientation, but then move into a present time frame. And so you have different types of conditions, and those are really interesting to study and to think about why the author has chosen to do that. Let's talk about future conditions first. These are cast into the future time frame. And basically you have three different vividnesses, if that's a word, three different ways to form these construction, and the difference has to do with how vivid the scenario is being described. So the future most vivid is also considered or called an emotional condition. And this is used to express strong feeling, and often in warning context. Its construction is the if part is formed with E and the future indicative, and then the conclusion is also in the future indicative. Notice that the future indicative presents a concreteness that is not going to be found with the other future constructions of conditions. So here we have 2 Timothy 2:12, if we deny him, if we will deny him, then also that one will deny us. Now that's a warning of sorts. It's a very unfavorable outcome, and that's when future most vivid conditions are used. Now the default future condition is called the future more vivid condition. This is the standard run-of-the-mill future condition. It's formed with aeon with the subjunctive, then followed by the future indicative. A future less vivid condition is also called a fourth class condition. This is relatively rare, and there may only be one complete example of this in the entire New Testament. It's formed with the optative. That's one of the reasons why it's so rare, because the optative is so rare. It's formed with the optative in the supposition, E with the optative, and then the conclusion has an optative with on. And so you can see this example here. Present conditions are cast into a present time frame, and they have three different types. The first type is called the present general. Now what's interesting about the present general condition is that it's speaking of a general truth, a generalized truth. And this becomes significant for exegesis because certain truths are general. They hold generally true any time or all of the time. And so to recognize this kind of condition is really important. Now it's very similar in formation to the future more vivid. The supposition is the same. The difference has to do with the time frame in the conclusion. It uses a present indicative, or as we'll see, maybe an imperative mood verb form, which is equivalent to a present tense. So no one is able to do these things which you are doing unless if God were not with him. Now this is a generalized truth. Jesus is doing things, and Nicodemus here is saying this can't be done except that God were doing it. It's a generalized truth, and the condition points us to understand that. Paul says whenever someone turns to the Lord, a generalized truth, the veil is removed. And so this is a general truth. This is true generally, and that's the meaning of the present general condition. Now the present simple is just a simple supposition that is circumstantial, and it's occasional. And so it's formed with E in the present indicative, then followed by the present indicative. This is the run-of-the-mill standard present time frame condition. Now a really fun condition is the contrary to fact type. And we have a past and a present contrary to fact condition. The present contrary to fact condition is formed with E and an imperfect indicative verb, and then it's followed by the imperfect tense verb and typically on. These are actually hard to translate. Now what's being conveyed by this construction is the admission that this isn't true, but if it were true, then this would be happening. But this isn't true, so this isn't happening. So the condition in its form is admitting the unreality of the condition, not the logic. The logic is still there, but it's admitting that this scenario is not true. So here in John 5:46, if you were actually presently believing in Moses, you would be believing in me. Now the form of the condition is indicating that they're not truly believing in Moses, and therefore they're not truly believing in Jesus. Look at the example here for how to translate this construction. It's a little bit unusual to translate, fun to find, and hard to translate. Well, let's look at past conditions. There are two main past time frame conditions, the past simple and the past contrary to fact. A third kind, the past general, is very rare. These three types correspond with the present simple, present contrary to fact, and the present general conditions. So the past simple is the default past time frame condition. It's formed with E and a past indicative verb, an aorist or imperfect, and then the conclusion is with the past indicative. The past contrary to fact is used to indicate that these situations are untrue, and they're marked for being untrue even though the logic may be true or is assumed as true, but it's admitted in using this construction, the author or the speaker is indicating that they believe that the supposition is untrue, and so therefore the conclusion is untrue. It's formed with E and then a past indicative form, and then the conclusion is a past indicative plus the particle on. Now there's some overlap in construction with the present contrary to fact and the past contrary to fact because both can be formed with imperfects. And so context is the only way that you can determine whether there's a present time frame or a past time frame. Now this past general condition is really rare. In fact, these may be the only two instances of the form that exist in the New Testament of the conditional form. So by looking at Smythe's grammar and carefully understanding the semantics of this, I was able to then determine that these are in fact instances of a past general condition. And this is formed with an optional on, with an imperfect indicative, and then is followed by an imperfect indicative. And so here in these two instances, which may be the only instances in the New Testament, Mark is trying to convey that something that was happening generally would result in a conclusion. And so these were general things that were always happening given these scenarios. And so given these suppositions, these conclusions were generally following. So wherever Jesus would go, into villages or into cities or into fields, in open spaces, the crowds would set out the weak and they would be pleading him that they would touch even the edge of his garment. So this was generally true. When these circumstances were met, when this was going on, this is what would be happening. So as many as would touch him were healed. This was the general rule set in the past time frame. Now mixed conditions occur quite frequently, and that is when the supposition will be of one type, one time frame, and then the conclusion will be of another. And studying the differences of semantics involved usually has exegetical significance. So here in Romans 6:8 we have a past simple condition, if we died with Christ, that is merged then with a present simple condition, we believe that we will also live with him. So the past is impinging upon the present. And so the mixing of time frames informs our faith, and conditions are used to connect logically different time frames or different types of scenarios with others. So have fun studying these examples and finding mixed conditions. Now it's also possible to subclassify conditions depending on the semantics. You've got temporal semantics, you've got relative semantics, you've got locative semantics, and quantitative semantics. And so these different words will add different semantic contributions to the type of condition. And you can study these examples below and pay attention to what the different semantics are. Now here's some miscellaneous things about conditional sentences. First of all, you can mark emphasis on the conclusion by adding an explicit then. So ara can be added to mark the apodosis more emphatically. You can also have conditional sentences that are not only mixed, but they will have a double protasis. And so you'll have two different protasises working with one conclusion. So two different suppositions, one conclusion. And sometimes these can be even of different kinds. So here is e, and then you also have aeon. So you can read those explanations there. Not uncommonly, you find imperative mood verbs being found in the conclusion or the apodosis. I tend to treat these as present tense forms. So in your analysis of the conditions, that's my suggestion. You also can find participles that seemingly would set up a condition with the conjunction os, usually. And here's some examples of that. And sometimes it's possible that you'll have implied verb forms. The verb will not be specified. Well, let's look briefly at exception clauses. Exception clauses are really one class of condition that are formed with imi or aeon me, and they're usually translated except or unless. And these are significant because they're usually stressing what is accepted. And so you can read this discussion here. Stephen Runge has done a lot of work on these and talks about their implications. So typically these exception clauses will come at the end. They'll come after the main clause. And remember that that's a more marked position for conditions. Conditions normally will begin with a supposition first, the if part, then the then. And these exception clauses actually show a more marked positioning. So here are some of the constructions. I review James Boyer's study on this, and he found that these exception clauses need to not have a verb. Well, that's true most of the time, or almost all the times, with ime, but not with aeon me. And so the construction is that you'll have a negation, and then you'll have the exception. Or you'll have a rhetorical question that expects a no or a negative answer, and then the exception. The positioning will usually be after the negation, but sometimes you do have some placed forward. If the exception clause is placed in the forward position, that's a more marked placement. Sometimes the verb is implied, sometimes it's explicit. Usually with ime, it is implied. But with aeon me, it is not. It's always an explicit verb. Also look for other words that might help offset the exception, the unless or the except part of the exception clause. Well, in what follows, I have an extended discussion of these exception clauses. And so here's an example of one. A prophet is not without honor except in his home country. So there's the exception clause, and it is a type of condition. So if you have time, you can read this extended discussion where I look at different types of exception clauses. Well, this brings us lastly to talk about qualitative emphasis. Qualitative emphasis is the use of pronouns that are particularly marked to indicate quality. So Greek has these pronouns that, when they're used, are pointing to quality. And so we need to pay attention to these kinds of words. What they do is they will stress something of the quality of the word that they're modifying. Such as this, such kind as this. What kind? So here's a listing of different pronouns that denote quality. So these pronouns are chosen because they point to quality. And so that's why they're so important, is that an author is directly pointing us, his audiences, to consider the qualities that these pronouns are pointing to. So Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15:48, is trying to talk to the Corinthians about different resurrection bodies and how those bodies compare with earthly realities. And so he's using these pronouns of quality to stress his points about those distinctions and those similarities. Here's another example where Paul is saying, hey, I'm going to come to you, Corinthians, and he says, I'm afraid that somehow when I come to you, after coming, I will find you not how. That is, as in what kind of quality of state that I would want you to be in. And he says also that I will be found by you not how, that is, in what kind of way or disposition you would want. So the Greek here is stressing the quality by using these pronouns, in this case a relative pronoun that is not just a relative pronoun, but a relative pronoun that stresses quality. Well, have fun with this discussion. Be sure to look at the case in point, which will talk about correlative pronouns as they are found in the Golden Rule. And this is in Matthew, and this is a good place to end. I can't think of really a better place to end a textbook that looks at New Testament Greek than to look at the Golden Rule found in Matthew 7:12.